Much has been said about the legendary deeds of Winston Churchill, the wartime leader who inspired Britain during its darkest hours. But far less is known about the young Churchill, a man who, long before the Battle of Britain, began carving out his legacy with a mixture of valour and vice. From the arid deserts of southern Africa to the stormy depths of Ireland, Churchill wrote his name into the annals of the British Empire, a name associated not only with bold decisiveness, but also with an unflinching readiness to use brute force to secure his aims. And nowhere was this clearer than during the Tonypandy Riots of 1910, when Churchill, as Home Secretary, faced a crisis in the coal-rich valleys of South Wales. A miners' strike over poverty wages escalated into chaos, and Churchill's response was swift, decisive, and brutally controversial. He sent in a Royal Navy warship to Cardiff Bay and stationed troops nearby as police batons clashed violently with protesters' bodies. This was not a foreign battlefield, it was Britain itself, and the government was at war with its own people. But what sparked this war? To understand, we need to dig into the roots of the conflict in the Rhondda Valley, the coal-filled veins of Britain's industrial empire. Beneath the green hills of South Wales lay the black treasure that powered factories, ships and railways across the world. Yet the men who dug this coal out of the earth lived and worked in misery. Their days were spent in suffocating darkness, their lungs choked by coal dust, their backs bent from endless labour. 12-hour shifts underground earned them just enough to feed their families, a thin meal of bread and dripping, if they were lucky. The spark that ignited the Tonypandy Riots can be traced back to the Ely pit in Pennygraig, where the Naval Colliery Company had recently opened a new coal seam. At first it seemed like a promising development, but trouble was brewing underground. Owners accused the miners of deliberately slowing their work during a trial period, but the workers had their reasons. The roughly 70 miners assigned to the seam insisted that the work was far more gruelling than other pits due to a stubborn stone band running through the coal. Tempers flared, and trust between workers and management began to crumble. By September 1st, 1910, the situation escalated. The company locked out the 70 miners working the new seam and shut the gates on all 950 miners at the site. The mine owners then announced pay cuts, slashing wages that were already barely enough to survive. For the miners, this wasn't just an insult, it was a death sentence. This move turned a localized dispute into a full-blown crisis. The miners fought back, going on strike. When the Cambrian Combine, a powerful group of mine owners, called in strikebreakers, the miners responded by picketing en masse. Entire communities united in solidarity. Women stood shoulder to shoulder with their husbands, while children marched beside their fathers, holding banners demanding justice. The miners' strike was not just about money, it was about dignity, survival, and the right to a fair day's pay for a back-breaking day's work. But as the weeks dragged on, frustration turned to desperation. Hunger gnawed at the miners' families and tempers flared. In the small town of Tonypandy, peaceful protests gave way to chaos. Crowds of miners, angry and starving, clashed with the police. Windows shattered, shops were looted, and the narrow streets echoed with the shouts of defiance. What began as a strike was turning into a full-blown riot, and the authorities were losing control. When news of the riots reached London, it landed on the desk of Winston Churchill, the Home Secretary. At just 36 years old, Churchill was already making a name for himself as a bold and decisive leader, unafraid to use force to maintain order. He had seen conflict up close during his military service in Sudan and South Africa, and he believed that swift, uncompromising action was the key to preventing chaos. To Churchill, the events in Tonypandy were more than just a local labour dispute, they were a test of his leadership. Churchill wasted no time. He dispatched metropolitan police officers, men hardened by years of experience on London's rough streets, to reinforce the local forces. But that wasn't all. Fearing that the riots might escalate further, Churchill sent military troops to the outskirts of the Rhondda Valley, keeping them on standby in case the violence spiraled out of control. And then, in his most controversial move, he ordered the HMS Antrim, a Royal Navy warship, to Cardiff Bay. The ship, armed with heavy guns, loomed over the coast like a steel leviathan. Its silent presence was a chilling message to the miners: defy us and we will crush you. Though the warship never fired a single shot, its purpose was clear: to intimidate the strikers and remind them of the overwhelming power of the state. To the miners, it was a symbol of betrayal, a declaration of war by their own government. Back in Tonypandy, the streets were in chaos. Reinforced by the Metropolitan Police, the local authorities launched a brutal crackdown. Armed with batons, the police stormed into crowds of miners, striking down anyone who resisted. Blood stained the cobblestones as men fought back with desperate courage, wielding stones, tools, and their bare fists against the overwhelming force of the police. The cries of defiance were drowned out by screams of pain. Women wept as their husbands and sons were dragged away, beaten and bloodied. Overhead, the shadow of the HMS Antrim loomed, its silent guns a constant reminder that things could get even worse. For the miners, this was more than just a fight for wages. It was a battle for survival against a government that seemed determined to break their spirit. In the end, the miners were defeated. The strike collapsed under the weight of hunger, exhaustion, and overwhelming force. The workers returned to the pits, humiliated and impoverished, their wages unchanged, their working conditions as deadly as ever. For the miners, it was not just a loss of a labour dispute, but a crushing blow to their dignity and hope. The scars of the Tonypandy Riots ran deep, both physically and emotionally. In the valleys of South Wales, the name Winston Churchill became synonymous with betrayal, a man who had unleashed the might of the British Empire against his own people. But the Tonypandy Riots were not the last time Churchill would deploy force to confront dissent. His role in suppressing protests and uprisings, both at home and abroad, added further layers to his controversial legacy. Just a year later, in 1911, he oversaw the siege of Sydney Street, where armed anarchists were besieged in East London. Churchill's decision to send in troops and personally supervise the operation drew criticism for being heavy-handed and overly theatrical, with many accusing him of risking lives for political gain. Churchill's approach to suppressing unrest was even more notorious in the context of British colonial rule. During the Irish War of Independence, he supported the deployment of the Black and Tans, a paramilitary force infamous for their brutality against Irish civilians. To many in Ireland, Churchill's name became a symbol of imperial oppression, a label that persisted long after his death. In other colonies, from Iraq to India, his support for using military force, including airstrikes and even chemical weapons, to maintain British control, further cemented his reputation as a leader unafraid of deploying violence to achieve his aims. At home, Churchill's response to the general strike of 1926 echoed the hardline tactics of Tonypandy. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he advocated for a forceful suppression of the strike, famously declaring, "Either the country will break the general strike, or the general strike will break the country." Tanks were stationed in London, troops were on standby, and government propaganda worked overtime to discredit the strikers. Though the strike ended without mass violence, Churchill's unwavering stance against labour movements alienated many working-class communities. For decades, the Tonypandy Riots were remembered as a symbol of the government's willingness to crush labour movements with brute force. Even as Churchill rose to global fame during World War II, celebrated as the indomitable leader who stood against Nazi tyranny, his name remained a bitter curse in the coal-stained valleys of Wales. To the miners and their descendants, Churchill was not just the hero of Britain's darkest hour, he was also the architect of their darkest days. Churchill's legacy is one of contradictions, a man hailed as a saviour by many but remembered as a villain by those who felt the weight of his iron fist. His actions at Tonypandy and beyond force us to confront the uneasy truth that even the most celebrated leaders can leave behind shadows of pain and betrayal. To this day, the events of Tonypandy force us to ask, when does the defensive order cross the line into oppression? What do you think? Was Churchill's response justified, or was it an unforgivable act of betrayal against his own people? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe to Valor and Vice for more interesting stories from history.